Good afternoon and welcome to our Plan for Water meeting for July 25th, 2023. Thank you all who have taken the time to be here today. Really appreciate your presence, and we are going to run this like a workshop, Q&A as we go along. But before we do that, we're going to start with a pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I got it. So we do have some members of the public on Zoom, and Jennifer will be monitoring. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and Jennifer will be monitoring that. And then for those in the public who would like to come up and speak, if you can just come to the podium and state your name and ask your question or whatever information you'd like to provide, that would be appreciated. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Awesome. So I think we will just get started. As President Hall just stated, please feel free to use the podium, but please do use the microphone so our friends at home can hear you. And then any member from the public can use the chat. So we will get kicked off. As everybody knows, we're in combination stages, so we are getting to the fun part. And the ladies with us today will kick the presentation off. It's basically in two separate parts. And please, as we're going, jump in, ask for any clarification or additional questions that you may have, and then we will proceed along. This one should be fun. We did preview this information with the small stakeholder group, had some really good questions and feedback. We have committed to making a couple of changes to the demand matrix to clarify some of the terminology that we're using, so look for that to come out probably in the next week or so.
Thank you.
All right, with that, turn it over.
Okay, let me see if this.
There you go.
Okay, let me see if this. Oh, it does work, and it's very sensitive. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Luciana Cunha. I think I have met many of you before, but just in case. I'm the Vice President at West Consultants, and we are working on the projected hydrology. So today, not sensitive anymore. Okay, today we are going to talk about two very exciting topics, as Jennifer mentioned. We are going to talk about the future, so we are going to talk about projected hydrology and projected demand. But before we go into the future, we are going to kind of stay in the past a little bit, because what we want to do is to really show that the models that we are using correctly represent the past. Because if they don't correctly represent the past, we can't have hope that they are going to correctly represent the future. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to go down to that. But after I show that, I'm going to describe a little bit what we did to select the bookend scenarios. Okay, so here is, again, an overview. Last time I was here, I kind of focused on the two first squares there, the global climate models and the downscale meteorological variables. And today, I'm going to go into the next step, which is using those variables as input to our hydrological model to generate the projected hydrology, right? And then Katie is going to talk about the projected demand, and all this information is going to go into the reservoir operation model. Okay, so this is just a reminder of what we have talked on May in terms of climate change. There are like 100 models out there generated by 50 different organizations across the world. It doesn't matter which model you use, which scenario, temperatures are going to increase, okay? However, there are different scenarios of emissions, and based on the scenarios, the increase are different. So you can see that on this figure here. That's just a reminder. I'm not going to dig into details on the climate models again, because we did that in May, but I do have support information by the end, so if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Okay, so you're gonna see this schematic throughout the presentation. So what we did was to run our hydrological model, as I mentioned, to the past, to the historical period. And the historical period here is 1976 to 2021. And then later, I'm gonna talk about the future period, which is 2022 to 2021, okay?
I have a question.
2071.
2071, sorry.
Hi, thank you for being here. So we don't have historical climate data before 1976?
Climate data? We do have,
We do
have climate data. We don't have so many observations in terms of inflow and other things like that. So it's really hard to try to capture what has happened in the past before 1976. Another thing is the data, rainfall data, for example. We have rainfall data, but it's just so low quality, right? We really want to look and dig on this path where the data is not as good as that data that goes from 1976 to 2021. Now, the 1976 to 2021 was defined based on the unimpaired flow. So if you remember the last time I was here, I presented climate change and Megan represented the unimpaired inflow hydrology, which depends on gauge data. So in order to generate that information, she needed the gauge data. The gauge data is very unavailable before 1976.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you for that explanation.
No problem.
I knew we had historical records going back
yeah,
a long time.
But that's
true.
clarifying
Yeah.
why
Yeah, I
that's
wanted to
range.
clarify it. Thank you.
That's a good point. Okay, so we'll start by talking about the past. So what is bias, and why should we care about it? So bias is basically a systematic distortion. So if you look at this schematic, and you can't really see on this, but you can see on this one. On the left, you see a target and you see the points there. You know, they are not exactly in the middle of the target, but they are around it. They are precisely around it, right? So that's how we see models. Models are not perfect. They are not going to be perfect, right? But if a model output is like what is being shown on the left, it's a pretty good model. It's capturing pretty well what's happening in reality. Now, if the model is doing what's shown in the right, that's what we call a bias model. Basically, it shows a distortion, even though the points are very close to each other. So it's precise in some ways. You don't have one point in each direction, but it's biased because it's not right in the center, right? So that's what we want to make sure. So a bias for us would mean we are underestimating or overestimating inflow. We don't want to go either way, right? We want to be right on target. So here, we evaluated the bias in the rainfall runoff model. That was our first step. We want to make sure the model is not biased. And we also evaluate the bias in our climate models. We want to make sure the climate models are not distorted, right? Okay, so here.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sorry, this might be really, how do you know, so with the biased model, or, thank you. How do you know where the center is with that? I mean, how do you know where the target is if you don't have any other context?
Yeah, and I will show a little bit of that. What we did was we calculated the center based on 3 different methods.
Okay.
And they are totally independent, right? One method is not affecting the other. If the 3 different methods are right in the center, that gives you confidence that you are in the center.
Okay, thank you.
So that's basically what we did, and I'm going to show a little bit of it. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is provide an update on the hydrological model calibration. And what you're seeing here is inflow mean bias. So as I mentioned, it's bias on the inflow. So it's kind of, is it distorted? Is it to the side? Are we overestimating it or are we underestimating it? The colors here represent a scale that goes from very good to unsatisfactory. And this scale is the official scale that is used by the Army Corps of Engineers to define bias in hydrological models, okay? if you remember, we actually calibrated 5 years, 2 dry years, 2 wet years, 1 median year. The results I'm showing here is for 2004, but all the other years' results are very similar. I didn't want to show results for all the years. So this is what we got from the hydrological model before calibration. Okay?
So I have a question, sorry about this, but, so when you say, this model on the left is before calibration and it shows these red areas, and it's unsatisfactory. Unsatisfactory what?
It's high bias.
High bias of what?
Yeah.
Water flow?
Inflow, mean bias. Inflow.
Luciana, are you comparing what you actually know occurred to what the model is predicting that happened for that particular
That's what
time?
I'm asking.
That's what they're doing.
Perfect, yeah.
That's what the bullseye is, right? The bullseye is the historic
Right.
information, and they're trying to make sure that we get.
Yeah, I get that, but you know, when you have these maps that shows good, very good, wet, it's kind of hard to tell what that is, so that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, so we are analyzing flow mean bias. So the way we do it is, for example, we have a reservoir, right? We can do water balance in the reservoir to estimate what is the inflow to the reservoir. Looking at the past, okay? What was the inflow to the reservoir? And when we do calibration, we actually run the model and calculate inflow to the reservoir. And then we compare both. So we are comparing what the model is predicting with what the data is telling. Yeah, exactly. If they are very different, then it's the distorted information, right? If they are all on target, that means it's good, it's green, it's very good or good depending on how much bias you have. Okay, so after calibration, you can see that we went, in some areas we had red, and we, in general, have very good results. And if it's not very good, it's at least good. So calibration did what it was supposed to do. It fixed any distortion in the model. Now, what I'm presenting here is 1 year, right, 2004. But that method, which is the calibration, does not really tell me if it's biased for other years. We calibrated 5 years. So what I'm going to do here is to look at the whole 1976 to 2021, so the historical period that we have the best data for. And we did it using 3 different methods, totally independent from each other.
I remember going through the methodology.
Yeah, so the first one is the gauge proration, which was the one that Megan explained the last time I was here. And I'm not going to get into details unless you guys wanted me to go back to it. But the second one is basically we have a gauge all the way downstream from the basin, right? That measures stream flow, okay? So we know how much water is getting there. And then we add to it all the losses and the applied water, okay? And that gives me all the volume of water that has been generated in the basin for each day. That's the way we do it. And the last one is the hydrological model that takes all the physical process into consideration from, rainfall, transpiration, evaporation, snow accumulation, snow melting, until generation of runoff. So these are 3 different methods independent of each other. And here is what we get as result. So we have, this is average annual inflow. So it's how much inflow you get in average across the whole period of record, 1976 to 2021. And we can see that we are right on target. The model did a very good job. The 3 different methodologies are very close to each other. Okay, so now we are going to start looking at the bias in the climate models. But before I go there, you're going to see a lot of those letters, and I want to explain what they are. So we have 7 models and 3 different scenarios. And we discussed that during the last meeting, where, even though there are 50 models out there, 100 models out there, we don't want to use the 100 models. We wanted to use the best models for California, and that's what we did. And we also use 3 different scenarios, which is like the optimistic, middle of the row, and pessimistic. So this is what these letters mean, okay? And then there is a certain name convention. And the name convention is basically the first letters before the underscore is the model, is the name of the model. the last letters is the scenario. Now, I wanted to mention this here because I want you guys to know what I'm showing, but the name doesn't really matter. Each model is a model. That's the way we are looking at it, right? Each of these models have passed the test of not being biased. Each of these models have been selected as best models for California. So here is about all the models that look at equal models of equal likelihood to happen. Okay, so here what we are seeing is a similar plot that I showed before. Before I had 3 lines because I just had 3 different methods, but now I have 18 models, so I have 18 bars, 18 different bars, and the green line is the what we observed with the gauge proration, right? So you can see that the models are pretty much on target. So what this tells us is that when we look at the past, the climate models are doing a great job. Yes, they are not perfect. We never expect models to be perfect, but they are doing a great job on representing the past.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm sorry, that page just went away.
Okay, yeah.
Every time in the clause says TAF, I assume that's total acre feet?
1,000.
Thousand acre feet.
Uh-huh.
So, top there, we're at 1444, that's. Question is how many acre feet? Add 2 zeros over to 3 zeros.
Yeah.
So that'd be 144,000.
Mm-hmm.
So, 1.4 million.
Million, yeah, 1.4 million.
I'm having trouble because there wasn't a.
You should read it,
Scale.
you should read it as 44,000.
Yeah.
That does not help some of
No.
us.
Non-math people.
3 zeros.
Thank you
I
very much.
got it.
And it's good to keep those values in mind because, you know, this is how much water, the volume of water you have in average per year, right? And then you can compare to the volume of water that you have for demand, for example, right? They are directly comparable. So it's good to keep the order of magnitude in mind. Okay, so let's look at projected periods. And again, we have 7 models and 3 scenarios. For some of the models, we didn't have all the scenarios. So in total, we actually had 18 different realizations of climate change. And these are the ones that we selected as high bookend, medium, and low bookend. And I'm going to get into details on how we did that selection next. So here, what you see is on the bottom, the climate models and the scenario with the name convention I mentioned. On the y-axis, you see average total inflow. So the same thing I was showing before, but, you know, 1,000 acre feet, and you will see that there is more variability because now we are looking at the future. We are not looking at the past anymore. We are not looking at what has happened, but what is being projected to happen, right? And this is looking at a window of 1 year. So you'll see that, you know, it goes from 0.8 million to 1.3 million acre feet. And the color represents the bookend scenarios that we have chosen. So red is a very dry scenario, green is a medium, and blue is a wet scenario, okay? Now, you might say, well, a drought during 1 year, it doesn't really matter that much. What we are more worried about is a drought that lasts, you know, 5 years. So this other plot here shows the values for a 5 years window. And the third one shows the plots for a 10 years window. But the general idea here is that no matter the window that we are choosing, we are kind of on the bookend, pretty much on the bookend. We are selecting a very dry year, a medium year, and a wet year. Here are some time series. So this is total annual inflow, okay? So this is the real-time series of inflow that we observed in each year. And you can see that goes from 3.5 thousand acre feet to, you know, below, like around 0.2 thousand acre feet. So there is a very big, million acre feet. There is a pretty big variability. You can see the book and high, the blue line, you can see periods of very high inflow, which you cannot see in the other scenarios, right? In the median one, you did have few years of high inflow, but they didn't last long, it was one isolated year. And you can see that the bookend low is really low, especially because there are actually sequences of very, very low years. Here, the same information, but accumulated throughout years. So as you accumulate the inflow, you have total annual inflow over the whole period of time, right? So you can see that over the whole period of time, we have 41 million acre-feet for the low book end compared to 65 to the high book end, which is the wet scenario. And you can see that they go kind of along until you reach 2040, and then they really start to divert, right? Here is average annual temperature. So again, as you can see, for all the scenarios, temperature is increasing. Actually, temperature is increasing the most for the high, the book and high, which is the wet, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But what it's telling us is temperature is, a big factor, but other factors might be when rainfall happens, with what variability in space, right? What is the sequence of dry and wet years? How dry does it get? How wet does it get? So temperature is one component that is very important, but it's not the only component. When is the snow melting, right? So all those things matter. Okay, so next steps, we will develop 9 different scenarios. So I'm presenting the 3 climate scenarios here, and Katie is going to present the 3 demand scenarios. And with that, we have 9 different combination of scenarios that we are going to feed into the reservoir operation model. And then from these 9, we are going to select 3 representative scenarios, and then we are going to simulate strategic alternatives. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
First.
Yeah.
And you doing that to the previous deck, so. Looking back at your model, is there something other than the temperature that around 2040 that causes this divergence? Are you able to pinpoint what it is?
We didn't really focus on pinpointing it, but for example, there are changes in and we are looking at it right now.
Okay.
We didn't do it before. We definitely are doing it right now to try to explain that variability. But things like, when are temperature increasing, right? So like what we are showing here are average, right?
Yeah.
Where is temperature increasing? And everything that we have shown was based on the average. Where it's happening is a big component that is not really being laid out at this point.
Sure. Okay. We'll give you more time. It would be interesting to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see in the, you also see in the diagram in that 2040 range where you saw a big jump on that one.
In preset.
Yeah, you see a big diversion on that graph right there, and then they go back to paralleling themselves as they continue up. So you see like the big blue, which makes that one really jump up. But then after that, you see they pretty much stay on the same trend as they go up. So in those models, there was some big event that caused the change to become quite large in that 2040 range time frame, plus or minus 10 years. And then it's starting to track like the other ones were.
Yeah, and you can see the event right here, right? Was this very big period of very high inflow that happens on the 40s for the bookend high, right? But in general, even if you remove that event, the bookend high has other major events, right? Like when, if you look at the bookend low, you really don't see any major event. So that's what we were trying to capture, kind of 2 extremes.
And you may have more questions as this ties into the next portion.
I do have a question on the average annual temperature chart that's 2 slides down. Can you talk more about this slide and how to interpret it?
So this is average over the area of interest. So it's average for the whole watershed, right? So the take-home note from this slide is temperature is increasing. Temperature is one of the factors, but it doesn't explain everything. We really need to look at where temperature is increasing, because if it did explain everything, we wouldn't see that the high bookend, the wettest one, was actually the one with the highest change in temperature, right? So there are other factors that play a role. And temperature is important because it also affects demand, right? It's important for how much inflow you're generating, but it's also important on the other components, but it's not the only factor. And we need to explore more the spatial variability, the temporal variability, and also there are differences in precipitation itself between these models, right? Even though we don't see a very strong trend we do see trends in precipitation, they are not as close as clear as trend in temperature, right? So we tend to say, precipitation is not changing much, but which season the precipitation is falling and how it combines with temperature change, it's a key factor. So this is kind of all averaged out, so we cannot really answer these questions by looking at those plots.
Will we be drilling down into the temperature as Director Hall has asked? Because that's one of the things that I had a question on this temperature grid, was where in the seasonality of this was happening. Is it warmer in spring, hotter in, it's like what parts of the year are we going to see these spikes and low times? Yeah,
and I totally agree. It's something very important to look at. I did look a little bit on the last presentation, and I don't know if you remember, actually it was one of the plots that created a lot of questions because I had the whole thing and the 4 seasons.
That's right.
And it did show, for example, that precipitation for 3 of the seasons didn't change, but for 1 of the seasons there was a change, right? Yeah. So I think not in the presentations it's too much to go there, but we will definitely go there in the report.
Oh, okay, that's what I wanted to know.
So we haven't ran water in the wintertime to protect our crops in 5 or 6 years. And yet before that, we were always running water to warm up the orchards. And then in the summertime, we're running water during the heat of the day to cool down the trees. So we're seeing it a lot in the winter and summer.
Yeah, temperature is important for our district, primarily because of when water is used and how it needs to be used. Once it gets hotter, we have to use more water, but also because of our storage system relies a lot on snowpack. So more precipitation that comes in the form of rain because it's too hot to stay in snow form poses its own challenges.
Well, thank you. I'm just glad to hear that there is going to be a greater drill down into the temperature and the seasonality of the temperature spikes and lows. Thank you.
So Michael, question?
Yeah, Michael Ross. Could you explain your determination of bias or no bias in the no data observed areas?
Okay, so let me go back here, because I think the maps show it a little bit, how we did it. First of all, we can only calibrate when we have data. If we don't have data, we can calibrate. We can do that comparison of observed versus simulated, right? Yeah. So the reason you see some like big chunks of areas, and I don't think they work, is because we have a gauge or a reservoir downstream from that big chunk of area that was used to verify that area. Okay, so we only have those, each coloring represents one specific observation location. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but once we have the observation, then we can compare the observation with the simulated.
So if this model is going to be used in the future and be recalibrated after new data is achieved after a year 2 years?
Yeah, it can, we can add data, add years.
Is there a plan to collect the data that will be required to involve the non-observed data areas into the observed data
I
areas?
think that's a question for the board.
Yeah, I mean, we would make the determination as we move forward if it's needed, but you know, what she's talking about is for the reservoir operations model, not the demand model down lower. What area are you talking about specifically, Michael?
I'm talking about all the non-observed data areas that are listed in this particular display.
Oh, okay. Let me tell you something about them. They are not really areas of interest for the district. So they matter for other things, but they didn't matter so much here. They are there because we develop, for example, for the, I forgot the,
He's talking about the gray areas.
yeah, the gray areas,
The lower gray areas.
the lower gray areas.
Like outside of our district, below campus.
That's outside of the district, so we didn't focus so much on collecting data for those regions, you know, because it was not really the main focus of interest.
Well, they're not all outside the district. Which great one is in the district? Well, it looks like it's right below Camp West, where I live. Oh, yeah.
Around where, the southwest or southeastern corner,
Well, I'm not sure. I think this area is.
that's pretty much our district.
It's mine.
Yeah, I don't.
And also remember, part of what we'll be doing in the future is having our annual discussions, and then maybe every 5 years, looking to see if the model's not jiving with what's actually happening. Then we go back and we recalibrate and redo the model, try to update to mimic what's happening. So, the board's already committed to doing that, on a 5-year process, with looking at it just every year to see if there's some big anomaly we need to address sooner than that.
Any more questions before we move off of this particular topic? And you can bring up questions when we move into the next slide. So we're just going to turn the mic over to Katie.
That works.
All right. Hi, my name is Katie Klug of Davis Engineering, and I'm here today to continue our discussion of the demand model. So in the last month's presentation and also at the January presentation, we talked about the processes and data sources used to develop the historical and current demand models, and also the sensitivity analyses to evaluate the different parameters and their relative influences on demand. So today I'm here to talk now about the projected demand scenarios. So starting from where we left off with the historical and current demands, taking what we learned from the sensitivity analyses to create those projected scenarios. So the agenda for today, for this part of the presentation, we'll start out with a quick review of the demand model. So there are slides that we've seen in past presentations, but just a quick refresh for everyone. And then we'll launch right into those projected demand scenarios, talking through a high, baseline, and low bookend scenarios. And then we'll talk through some results and next steps. So with that, then, I'll start with the overview of the demand model. And this will be pretty brief. There's quite a lot more content last month and in January, but I'm happy also to answer any questions. So demand, just to be sure that we're all on the same page, demand in this context is considered the volume of water that's needed to satisfy water users' needs. And consistent with the previous plan for water processes, we're considering the demand to be the sum of the deliveries to raw water customers, deliveries to treated water customers, the system losses that are incurred getting the water to those customers, and then also the municipal supplies, the raw water that's supplied to the municipal providers, and also environmental flows. And those are the environmental flows coming out of the reservoirs meant to meet, in-stream flow obligations and so forth. All right, our approach for the demand modeling is the same as discussed in our past presentations. We start with what we're calling our demand model. In the past presentations was our IDC model, and that's our means of simulating the demand on those raw and treated water customers' parcels. It's a physical model of what's happening on the land surface, so thinking about land use and temperature and precipitation and all the things that are happening on that land surface, and using that to estimate or quantify how much water is needed for those customers. And then we tie that to a water balance for the conveyance system, so that's our means of simulating the system flows and losses that are incurred getting water to the customers, and that provides us with a link back from the parcels all the way back up to the reservoirs, providing that connection point to the reservoir operations model. Then we also have the municipal supplies and the environmental flows. And the environmental flows, again, are simulated at the reservoirs. So we'll talk about today, and what we talked about in the previous presentations are mainly focused on the demand model for the customers' parcels, but happy to answer other questions as well. And this same schematic that Luciana showed a little while ago, we are today focused really on the projected demand there. So that's the lower box, highlighted in green. And I want to point out here that, of course, demand does not occur in isolation of other factors that impact the district. So the climate change scenarios, the downscaled meteorological variables, those are inputs to the demand model, and the outputs from the demand model are those, the amount of water that's required by those customers, and that feeds into the reservoir operations model. So that just provides some context for how this all ties together. With that, then, that was our high-line overview. I'm happy to answer any questions we have, though. Otherwise, we'll go right into the projected demand scenarios.
Thank you, I have a question. So what I didn't see in here was the regulatory demand, and I know we've talked about that, and maybe you couldn't yet do it because it's still unclear, but is the regulatory demand in here?
Not in this presentation today. That'll be talked about next month with the reservoir operations.
Because those get inputted at that location in the reservoir
The
operations model.
releases from the
we
reservoirs
have to
as
take
opposed
that
to
out.
demands from customers.
Right.
Yeah, but it's a supply side thing, but okay. But
It
it's
just
also kind of a demand thing.
It is, it's a hard one.
Confusing.
Yeah.
It is, but it's not necessarily driven, it's driven by temperature for year types, but it's not necessarily driven by these kind of details that we're talking about with the changes in temperatures and stuff, right? That's why we put it in the ResSim model and release that demand as part of the other demand during that process.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? All right, with that then, we'll get into the projected demand scenarios. So similar to the sensitivity analyses that we discussed last month, the purpose of these projected demand scenarios are to look at the potential range of future conditions that could occur in the district with regard to those factors that really influence demand. So that's going to be, customers, but also precipitation and temperature and climate, and changes perhaps in land use and so forth. So the purpose of these projected demand scenarios are to look at what is a sort of a baseline or median condition moving forward, so something sort of similar to what we've seen in recent historical years, and then also looking at a low bookend and a high bookend. So what's like the maximum and the minimum, somewhere within those bookends, we hope, we think that we will probably fall. Very unlikely to actually reach either of those bookends, but they are meant to be extremes so that we kind of capture the range.
So this picture, tree has demand,
Mm-hmm.
the weeds have demand. How do you calculate that? Because some places will be bare, some will have cover crops. How do you add it all up, or do you? Or you just take the evapotranspiration rate off for the tree?
Yeah, so the cover crops and other vegetation, in a particular area does get factored into our calculation of the evapotranspiration. So we have, if you recall from our last discussion last month, we talked about, our land use analyses. So we have these, 90 feet by 90 feet pixels, understandings of kind of what's happening across the landscape. So we have that resolution of data for land use, and whether that's predominantly, orchard or, whatever it might be. So we have that piece of information, and we also then have evapotranspiration at the same resolution. And so if, on average, orchards in NID do have a cover crop, then, that is calculated into the average ET for orchards in NID. So that is factored in. Does that help?
No, I just know that we have weeds out there, we put a lot more water on.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So the parameters that were adjusted primarily between these three different projected demand scenarios are really those that we talked about last month in the sensitivity analyses. And three of these I'll talk about a little bit more on the next few slides, but just to quickly highlight them. We did adjust the raw water customers, so how many raw water customers is NID serving in the future, and then we have bookends for that. Same for treated water customers, what's the population, are there changes in the population, are there changes in the treated water customers that are being served by the district. Evapotranspiration, this ties into both kind of the climate side of things, but also, crop and cultivation practices and other things that impact how much water is being lost to the atmosphere from vegetation. And then we also look at system losses. So in the low scenario, the baseline scenario and the high scenario, we looked at kind of a 5% range around what is kind of understood to be the best understanding of current system losses. And then we also had projected precipitation consistent with the climate change scenarios in our demand model as well. So that feeds in as one potential source of water for any vegetation in the district.
Can you take a moment to talk about system losses in more detail? How are those percentages developed? And so how did you pick the percentages that you picked? And what is the foundation for those percentages?
Yeah, so the 15%, it comes from, I believe, the raw water master plan, or in previous analysis. That was, I think we talked about that a bit last month, but it's really, an understanding of what's coming into the system and what's coming out of the system, less deliveries that are made. So that's where that 15% comes from. If that, I don't know if there's...
Yeah, and that, we're not differentiating within that system loss what's evaporation versus, what's going through the soils, et cetera. So it's just more of a balance thing. So it kind of lumps them all together into one system loss. So there's multiple pieces within that system loss.
But the evaporation coming out of the reservoirs is in the reservoir operations.
Correct. That's not part of this. This is only in the canal system. So, we don't have specific data that tells you each canal is 15% or one's 10,
Right.
one's 12, one's 14. That's kind of a general rule based on when we developed the last raw water master plan, using the mass balance thing effectively, that overall, historically, we've been losing about 15%.
Well, we tie it out with data that we do know, correct, Chip? You want to come explain how you tie it out?
So these losses are based on data from our canal gauges, what we've diverted. It's also based on customer purchases, and I think it's been brought up before and discussed. We don't measure at the meter for the customer. We don't have any way to measure that. This is a water balance, like Doug was saying, in that this is what we put in, this is what's leaving the system, and this is the net difference. So it's a 15% loss to the system.
I think that's a helpful definition, because we've talked a lot at different times about the fact that we really don't know what's happening at the gauge itself, or the water boxes. So that's
a parcel by parcel. But we do know what is coming in, what we are taking out and diverting, and what we are using down the system. That is very specific.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but we don't necessarily know if parcel A is using water
Right.
24 hours a day, parcel B is only using it 12 hours a day. We don't have that kind of information.
No. And we don't manage the system at that micro of a level.
Yeah.
So for example, this always comes up, and we've had this conversation a number of times now. Even in a situation with treated water, we are moving to a point, and other agencies are at a point where you can have minute-by-minute accurate meter use data. You still don't manage a system that way, because we are moving so much water through such a large geographical area. We don't use that parcel-by-parcel data for that.
I do have another question, and I'm not sure this is the appropriate time for it, but in thinking about my agricultural operation, when granted is very small, I require winter chill. And I can expect that I will not have my operation in future years because of the lack of winter chill as temperature increases. So I'm wondering if we have enough data on our agricultural operation in our region, because part of what we're anticipating for growth is growth in and support of our agricultural community. And I think that there is a real reality that with increasing temperatures, some of that operation will not be able to exist.
Yeah,
Other ones will.
Yeah.
The other ones will. That was my point.
Chris is the poster child for this.
Blueberries, for instance, and what she mentioned.
Peaches.
And ammonical nitrates.
which is why it's,
There's so many variables between crops.
which is why it's important that the district is committed to checking and updating this model on a regular basis, right? So we can start to see how the world really is changing and then make adjustments to the model to help better inform the next 50 years after we're 10 years out,
Right.
kind of thing, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Michael Ross again. I'm just bringing this up because it's fitting into this discussion that you're having right now. And that is, whether or not, in your demand modeling, whether or not, demand, management methodologies were incorporated in providing the bookends. Meaning, there's traditionally much that can be done on the demand management side. And when you look at the way in which properties could be used in agriculture and commercial properties as the earth warms up on the western slope, you will see crop changes that are able to be made in different elevations. And in order to do that, the district has a responsibility to actually profile the uses that are being used in agriculture to promote it. And that means you need to have a full spectrum classification of properties that shows the profile of how water is used on that property, so that you can advise a property owner like yourself, Karen, that you could then shift a different crop to make a profit in that economic activity. And if that property is being used in a commercial sense for agriculture, it is applicable to different regulations in the state, like the irrigated lands program.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a differentiation that has to be occurring to give alternatives to water supply alternatives, when we look at alternatives and strategies for meeting demands and supply in the district, okay? So my question to you is, did you, in the demand scenarios, include different scenarios for demand management alternatives?
Yeah, so I think that we'll get to factors that pertain to what you just described. And for one, the raw water customers. So one of the scenarios, which is a couple slides from now, does reduce the demand into the future. We also, on the evapotranspiration side of things, I think this will also be described a little bit more, but just to kind of preview it. We did look at, kind of the crop-related factors, so we have the climate-related factors that impact ET, but also, or evapotranspiration, but also the crop-related factors, and we did look at different levels of kind of that crop-related demand in those future scenarios. So I think that does get at, what you're hoping to see, so we'll talk through it then.
With the understanding that we're not getting parcel specific, so
Right.
the model's not gonna be able to say, your parcel located at this position should be, et cetera. We're looking at a bigger range of the district as a whole, not detailed down to the specific parcel. So we won't be able to give specific information to a parcel, but it could be within an area that would have that kind of information.
All right, let's move on.
I want a clarification. You had mentioned the system losses. This is Laura Peters. You had said that we know how much we're putting in the system and we know how much is going out. How do we know how much is going out?
That's through the gauges and the information that we have at the end of the canals. Tor and Chip could probably be better to be specific with regards to this type of measurements, but
I know as of a year ago, we didn't have gauges at the end of the canal.
We have some gauges, and we capture most of our ends of our canals. Now, we have some quarter CFS ends of canals that we don't refactor in the South Yuma. We don't have a gauge on that. The major ones where there's significant flow, we have gauges on. Now, we are expanding that to incorporate all the little small ones, but it's a big process, and it's a lot of expense for a little bit of a data value.
You have to, oh, go ahead.
So the one thing that I raised last time we talked about this is if I stop taking my water, you have no idea. So your gauge at the end of the tail, you get 6 more minor inches of water coming out. So your 15% number is a wag at best.
All water
So
loss
we
is
are-
a wag at best.
It is, but we are adding telemetry data
Yeah.
to give us real-time reads.
I'm not arguing that it's not the best that we can do today. So I'm just saying that we don't really know, because I'm not taking water 24/7.
Right, but it
could
gives,
be hotter one day.
Right.
Someone could be using more, someone could have greater head pressure on their orifice. Right,
Yeah.
just measuring the ends of the canals and what we're diverting and figuring the net balance.
But you also gotta remember, we're not putting into the system based off of what you're using on your parcel,
Right,
right?
right.
So that's why we have, it's so labor intensive right now, and why we're moving towards more sophistication on monitoring the canals and canal gates, so that we can have quicker reaction. But that's why a lot of those canal ends are either gauged or they're checked twice a day, so we're constantly metering water down or up based off of what we see happening.
And how does that, doesn't happen, how does that translate into a more finite loss number?
Being able to control the canals better, because right now we're going out twice a day as opposed to having a gauge out there that's auto reading at some greater.
So you're saying that
speed.
if you're adjusting more frequently, and I'm not taking water, you're adjusting for that, so that your calculation of the head and the tail should be fairly accurate of the loss?
But we're also, remember, we look at all of you as a whole group together, so we're monitoring the canal, not your water use.
Sure.
Right,
Yeah.
which is all you can do.
Right, remember, this is a planning exercise, and but to everyone's point, do we need better monitoring systems and operating systems? Absolutely.
no, and really the automation that I just want to step in here is kind of an opportunity to highlight that. The automation is not going to fix a lot of the longer canals, because the timing is not there, but it will adjust for diurnal factors and weather changes and things like that, that we can adjust in real time instead of having a whole crew out and doing these things. So, back to your point on the losses, your 15%, yeah, it's a little bit of a guess, because if we know how much people are buying, is that what we're putting in? No, not all the time.
Sure.
So we use the best data we have at the moment, that's what we're running with.
Yeah, we don't start feeding the canals based off how much water was purchased, right? We start feeding the canals based off of actual on-the-ground data, and there's a huge discrepancy in what that means.
Which in really hot weather, sometimes we're chasing our tail, but that's in our effort to try to be as conservative as possible,
Yeah.
not put too much in. On
That's
the
fair.
flip side, there's
Yeah.
certain days when it clouds up and rains, we're probably wasting a little bit.
So Chip, also water that leaves our system, our district, then becomes kind of environmental flows that could be supporting threatened species.
It does, and one of the things that Tor brought up, he was totally accurate about our gauges. There's, gosh, I wanna say off the top of my head, maybe 12 or 14 ends of canals that are truly lost to the district. We cannot recapture it. Those are the ones that we try to focus the most on. The rest of them usually trickle down into other canal systems, and we reutilize that wherever we can. So, we're currently trying to focus on the ones that are lost to the district, and let's get more accurate measurement on those, because those are more important to us to really gauge how much is truly being lost.
Well, I would just like to acknowledge the huge complexity of this in general, because I'm in, Placer County, the rural south part, and, on the Camp Far West Canal, and I think sometimes of where did that water come from? When was it released to get to where it got in my little operation? So anyway, I think it's easy to lose sight of the complexity of what it takes to get water from point A down to point B, hundreds of miles away, or whatever, 50 miles away.
Well, and that's also why we're having the bookend scenarios, right? We have multiple different scenarios to reflect this range of possible things that are occurring right now. And water loss, that's pretty standard within the industry. It's not outside of
That's what we got to in
anything.
the previous conversation, is nationwide, it's pretty standard.
It is a pretty standard number.
I would just add though, most districts are not our size. We're the second largest district in the state of California geographically. And so most districts are not dealing with 500 miles of open ditch canal. I mean, so I do think that, I'm not disputing these numbers. I'm just saying that it is highly complex, and my hat's off to the district.
Well, as we get better data and better sophistication, then we'll continue to revise the model and dial it in.
Yeah.
There we go.
All right, Michael.
Portofino.
Michael Ross again. Tripp, actually, addressed part of my question, but another gentleman came up here and answered some questions, but I don't know who he is. He said that at one point in time, the end of the canals were captured and reused, and I would like to know specifically how the district captures at the end of canals and actually puts it back to beneficial use for payment or non-payment. That's the first question. And the second question is, or not question, but just observation that the long distance conveyance of water is happening in this district. And the problems with it are very evident across California, on the long distance California.
That's right.
Water, and that's it right there, but, so how is the district capturing the water at the end of the canal?
Tails.
And how are they reusing it? Because it was stated just minutes ago that they were reusing, that NID was reusing it.
Great question. And by the way, that's Tor Larson, who's our water resource superintendent. And I didn't introduce myself either, I'm so close director of water operations. The way we generally reutilize the tail ends of canals is a lot of times the end of our canal will spill its excess water into what we call a random, which is a natural waterway. And then a lot of times it will spill right down into another canal system or waterway where we can pick it up again. There are also a number of some of the larger agricultural operations that have a little bit of runoff from their facilities as well that we can recapture in our canal systems. So those are kind of some of the examples, those are the bigger examples. For instance, another one, end of the Chicago Park out in the Sunshine Valley goes into the Wolf Creek, where we then redivert down below where we have water rights. So that's kind of an example. Most of the water system is interconnected in some way, but there are truly a handful of them that we totally lost to the district. So.
Do we have any hard data on acre feet or groundwater that ends up in that scenario?
We do track it. I don't have the numbers right now off the top of my head. And I will openly admit, some of the ends of these canals are very, very small, very hard to measure, and without automation going all the time, we're doing a grab sample read once in a while. So it's not as accurate as it really should be or could be, and we're working on that.
I do remember, Chip, that when you did the overview of our water system way back 2 years ago now, you have a graphic that shows all of the waterways, and you showed me how they all connect and feed each other, and so that was very instructive to see that it narrows down into a very small number of canals, as you say, that actually are lost to the system.
Yes. Complex, but all at
Yeah.
a time.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. All right, I think we're ready, Katie. Let's go.
Otis.
Otis Vaughn, just a former PCWA director. Just one quick view on what does a bag look like. And I mentioned it before. PCWA taking 100,000 acre feet of water. Finally got telemetry on the end of the canals, finally got baffles and controls on the front, finally automated. Hey, surprised everyone. We saved 15,000 acre feet of water. Of that 100,000, 40,000 is urban, 60,000 agriculture. So what was the savings in percentages? Was it 15% or was it actually closer to 25%? You know, so that's one element. DCWA looked at another conveyance that was in a very built-up area and discovered that the theft was 30%. So when you're making an assumption, you have water measured at the beginning, water measured at the end, and you're assuming that everybody in the middle is taking their contractual amount. When they're not, and most of them don't, and sometimes they're constricted by algae and other things where they can't get their full delivery, you have no idea the difference between theft, evaporation. Some of these canals go through the Merton Formation, which is incredible seepage directly into the American River subbasin. That's the main infiltration and recharge area for the American River subbasin. And really, until you get that parcel by parcel profile and understand each customer and what they are actually using and farm gate measurement, you'll have no way of discovering what that WAG looks like. And, you know, somewhere between 10 and 30%, give or take.
Depending on the canal.
Yeah, and giving or take, you know, again, a miner's inch is equivalent to flushing a toilet 9 times a minute. It is not insignificant.
All right, good comments. Now we're going.
I'll close out this slide by just taking us back to, you know, the process and these projected demand scenarios. There are 3 scenarios. There's a low baseline, a median, and a high baseline. So for each of these parameters, you know, there are kind of 3 cases that we consider, and in the lowest demand scenario, we take the low from every one of those. In the baseline, we take, you know, the baseline case for every one of those, and in the high for every one of those. So, you know, system losses, you know, recognizing that there is, you know, uncertainty in the 15% number. That's part of the reason, you know, we have on the low side, and by low, I mean, you know, low demand, so less water is, you know, needed to meet demands. So it's a little different than like, you know, low inflows on the kind of the supply side. But, you know, we have 10% losses there, so that's, you know, everything else being very low, what would the demands be if system losses were, you know, only 10%? And on the high side, what if it was actually 20%, you know, when everything else is also skewing toward high demand? So that's, you know, part of the consideration that went into the selection of those. Those are also a range of system losses that we've, you know, even that we've seen in other systems that we've worked with. So that provides a, you know, reasonable range, and that was also part of the sensitivity analyses. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to, I suppose this ties into what I was just talking about, but we do have those 3 demand scenarios. So we have the low bookend, the baseline, and the high bookend. And for each one of these parameters, there's a low baseline and a high value. But there's also climate-related factors that also impact demand. So those are going to be precipitation and temperature, as we've spoken about. So to highlight here, you know, as we are developing these demand scenarios, we do need to look at that full intersection of kind of the 3 cases, low, baseline, and high from the demand side, but also the wet, medium, and dry conditions on the climate side. And so looking at all 9 of those cases. So we'll talk through some of these parameters. We'll really just show 3 of these as kind of the high, the low, and the baseline, median today. But all 9 of those feed into the reservoir operations. All of those are documented, will be documented in the report and described a little bit more down the road. So the next few slides will focus really on that left column there, the low bookend, baseline, and high bookend for the demand scenarios. All right, so starting out with the raw water customers and the treated water customers, this table here summarizes the assumptions and considerations that went into selecting what is that kind of low bookend, the high bookend, so those extremes, and then the baseline conditions for that projected 50-year demand scenario. And in both of these cases, or in all 6 of these cases, I suppose, these values came from review of historical deliveries data to customers, both the raw and the treated water customers, so looking at growth in the number of customers that were served over time, and also looking at recent historical data with regard to you know, demand reduction, whether that's, you know, idling to reduce a certain amount of demand, or recent historical population, so kind of looking back into the past, what was the lowest population in the last 20 or so years, and what would demand look like, you know, with those different considerations in mind. So on the low bookend side, I'll focus on the raw water customers first. On the low bookend side, so that's, you know, lowest of the low demand, we are proposing for this bookend scenario to, you know, consider what would happen if demand for all the current raw water customers was reduced such that, you know, 20% of their demand was, you know, taken out by one means or another, whether that is through demand management, as was discussed, or if that is because of supply constraints or whatever it is that is causing, you know, those 20% of the total demand to be, you know, taken out. So that's the low bookend. On the baseline scenario, we looked at historical data, so looking from 2002 through 2022, and looking at how many customers and what delivery areas, or what irrigated areas rather, were added to the system over time. It came out to about 20 acres per year or so on average. So in the baseline scenario, we took that 20 acres per year and continued to add that into the future through the next 50 years. So that's the baseline demand scenario. And on the high bookend, we increased that by, you know, basically added 50% to that, so 30 acres per year of the developed land adding on. On the treated water customer side.
Can I ask a
Oh, yes,
question?
of course.
So on on your high bookend, you've got a 1.5x baseline rate. And so help me out, because I'm not the math whiz up here. So does that say essentially a 50% growth? Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly.
And, you know, there's not been anywhere on Earth that any studies anywhere, including our general plan, that it's a 50% growth.
That's not how it's reading.
That's not what it is.
No, so if you look at the baseline, so the baseline demand is, for raw water customers, is going to show a natural increase over the planning horizon based off of the historical increase.
Right.
All that's showing you is that baseline increase is 1.5 times, not that the whole demand is 1.5 times.
So they're 20 acres that they're.
Yeah.
The slope of the line increased.
I told you I wasn't a math whiz.
That increase, but just.
Well, I know, I'm going, wait a minute.
So if you look on the baseline, it says expansion to soft service areas at 20 acres per year of developed land, which means irrigated land.
Okay, well, you know what?
And then
Part of my problem was the thing I had in my packet says 150 acres.
Well, we changed it because it was confusing
Yeah.
based off of how it was
Very confusing.
because remember, and she explained this earlier, when she's looking at a full parcel, only a portion of that parcel is actually irrigated. So they take the total parcel area, and then she dials down onto the irrigated acreage within that full area.
Okay.
So we just modified it so it didn't cause this confusion. Because we're really talking about what the irrigated on.
Just, not 20 acres irrigated, it's 20 acres total.
No, that's 20 acres irrigated. The previous, in your previous packet, it showed whatever.
100 acres.
100 acres.
Yeah, so that was.
But of that, only the 20.
Only
was
20
being
is actually irrigated.
The larger number would be skewed by really large parcels, you know,
Yeah, so that's helpful, you know, I couldn't understand the difference between what I was seeing in my packet.
Oh, yes,
Okay.
that's the distinction.
Diana, you have a quick question?
Yeah, when I was looking, Diana Suarez, when I was looking at this, I was like 20 acres per year, 30 acres per year. If you take it out over 50 years, that's 1,500 acres. Is there 1,500 acres of unirrigated land that's available in Nevada County? The other things that came to mind was, are we assuming that the future is gonna look like the past? Because that's a pretty big assumption in this day of climate change and extremes. And the other thing, there was one more thing. He was talking about how you can recalibrate every 5 years. So the further out you go, the greater amount of uncertainty you have in your prediction.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so with the scenario of the low bookend, Diana, that is a scenario under which it is showing that something has changed drastically with the 20% demand.
And that's district-wide, so that's
Yeah.
Nevada and Placer County.
Yeah, I think
Not just,
it might be helpful to define scenario versus projection or simulation, right? Before, we were talking about simulations, using some model and projecting. This is just somebody coming up with a number. There's
based on historic.
it's an informed number that we
Right.
come up based off of historic data.
But this isn't using a demand model to project what the district is going to need.
Yeah.
Or is it?
No, it is, but you can run different scenarios through the same model. So we could come in and say, okay, there is gonna be a so she has the baseline, the model projects the baseline over the projection period. Then, based off of our different scenarios, she then comes in and makes modifications and compare those with climate change. So we'll end up with 9 different model runs with everything crisscrossed. So we can go, okay, well, what if there's a huge die-off in people, and population was down by 20%, but the worst climate change scenario happened. Do we need any water? So it helps you to frame what is the large amount of different things that can happen, because to Diane's point, it's 50 years out, so it's a long planning horizon. And then we'll start zoning in on what's most realistic or has the highest probability of happening, which is probably something in the middle. But this is all based off of real data. So if Katie, do you want to explain, so that when she's looking at the raw water demand over the soft.
In history, has Placer County idled 20% of their fields unless they were told they weren't getting water for right?
So this is part of a request with the stakeholder group to also run a scenario in which there was some situation that reduced demand. It could be, I mean, and you can get out there in your reasoning behind it.
It could,
Yeah, this is not just drought.
It could be the regulatory environment.
Oh, it could be, there is a giant bug that comes and eats something. It could be, there is alien that comes and has population control. I mean, you can get crazy.
We
It
could be
was just
running-
to have the book in.
It could be running the drought water contingency plan.
Oh,
That the district decides that we're gonna cut overall demand by
That's
50%.
That's not the demand.
That's management. That's
Yeah.
not the demand.
So you could say this, and I think what some of the stakeholders will probably say, what if the district found a legal pathway in which to ban watering ornamental turf with raw water? It could be something like that. The reason for doing it is to gauge what is realistic, because on the high book end too, you can say, there's gonna be massive development, we're gonna run out of water. So if you have your 2 worst case scenarios on both ends, it'll help everybody to zone in on what's probably more realistic to happen.
My contention is, regardless of any regulatory things, the demand is the demand, right?
Yes.
A regulation is oppression to that demand, saying that we're not giving you water for whatever reason, maybe it's a good reason, but the demand is still the demand.
And that's what the
And it's gonna be dictated by population and cultivation.
That's what the baseline is. So we're looking at a baseline that takes into account a projection of population that is similar to what has historically occurred, as well as water use. Because for me, the real answer is what happens with climate change on the baseline demand scenario? Just medium scenario climate change on the baseline demand scenario with no big movements on it. That will give you a lot of clarity.
Michael Ross. Trevor, stay with that, and also include demand management measures. And when you throw that into your scenario that you were just discussing, you will find different approaches to creating a different type of demand that could be met easy with a supply that might be less in the future based on climate change. I have a question to you about your historical rate of customers per year. I believe in the 2020 Ag Water Management Plan, there's a table that says that from 2014 to 2020, the average number of new customers in the district for raw water was 20. And then also, setting aside any metric, definitional noise on the metrics here, exactly, because it's just a slide. And also, am I to understand that the baseline is 20 acre per year developed land, and that's associated with the 50 customers? Is that true? Because if so, we got 50 customers of .4 acres, and that's not gonna happen.
No, so that's, the right column there is are the treated customers. So the center column
treated
there,
customers.
yes,
Oh,
raw
okay,
water
yeah.
customers.
So what, okay, so I was reading it wrong.
And also with regards to the urban water management plan, the raw water management plan that you were talking about, that looked from 14, is it 14, did you mention? So this one goes back farther, and what we've seen in the trend is that the numbers were higher earlier in our 20-year window that we looked at. So those are things we have to talk about, whether it makes sense to average that full amount, or maybe it's more likely we should be averaging based on the last few years versus last.
Okay, I'm a WAP, because I'm a water resource engineer, has done this for a long time. But still, the 2020 ag plan shows 20 customers average over 2014 to 2020. And 20 acres per year developed, that's 20 customers for 20 acres, that's 1 acre parcel. So there's a little bit of a metric definitional problem.
Right.
I see.
I don't,
So on Saturday, I'm starting to consult with the guy who's gonna start farming 40 acres. He won't convert it all in 1 year, but it won't take him long, and he'll need more water. So it's happening, where land is being converted to ag production for veggies.
I also know examples of ag businesses going out of
Yes,
business and
right.
closing the door.
Right.
remember, these are averages over a specific time period.
Exactly.
And so as,
And not to dispute your point.
Right.
I'm just saying that it's all a bigger picture of up and down.
Everybody flows in, flows out.
and this is a developed area, right? So this 20 acres could actually include, what was it, 120 parcels? Or 120 acres of actual parcels?
Keep in mind, last 3 years, record years in revenue in plastic. 90 million, 100 million, 110 million. Growing. Whether people are closing and other people are opening, it's growing today. Well, a lot of it's timber, so maybe. I didn't look at volume.
Laura?
And, yeah, Laura Peters. At the last meeting, I believe, Director Hall, you had requested information about the historical number of connections. You were gonna report on this meeting, that done?
That's included in this analysis, in the 20 acres. When we do the report, we'll provide the backup. So when she talked about the 20 acres per year of developed land, when they go into developing the demand for it, it's also taking into account that, how that connects to the system and where, so all of the other data gets tied in from a geospatial perspective. So it's not, we're just not adding flat 20 acres on top and picking some random number associated with it. So that, I think what Laura's talking about is that 1,000 feet from an existing canal, that soft service area.
Right.
Well, it gets further and further refined, right? So then we go back and we looked at, from a topographical perspective, would it need a lot of pumping? Okay, well, a canal's not gonna be pumped up to that elevation. So it's, the 1,000 feet was primarily used so that Katie had a basis by which she can go through and identify where the parcels that represent this 20 acres a year could be connected to. So then she would have geospatial data that has all of the crop data and all the ET data associated with it.
Intend that it should be more than 1,000, less than 1,000, or you just
Oh,
asked?
I just asked, I was just making sure that information today, and so you didn't, you're not directly giving me information, but you changed the way you report.
I don't know that it's changing it. I think we're just clarifying it a little bit better, what the 1,000 feet was used for.
You know, I was just gonna say, the information that went into the sensitivity analyses, that was, like, almost like bookends for the bookends, to kind of see, like, in a very extreme scenario, you know, how much acreage would that add, or how much demand would that add? But in the cases for these, you know, low bookend baseline and high bookend scenarios, we really, you know, refined down those initial sensitivity analyses and looked at things that are more conservative, and now, you know, to our understanding from looking at, like, the historical deliveries data and historical, you know, acreages that have been added, what is a reasonable bookend, as opposed to, you know, every parcel within 1,000 feet, which is not, you know, realistic.
Not realistic.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, thank you. And you mentioned this report, this is the first I'm hearing about a report, what's this?
It's always been part of the plan, so all of the plan for water process and everything will be documented in a final report.
And the plan for water process is one more meeting and we're done?
Oh, no. Got a lot more meetings.
No, I'm not sure where you got that one from.
Oh, good, I can hardly wait. Peter Van
We
Zandt.
expect to see you every once.
This is very interesting, by the way, and I'm enjoying it, but I have a question. Particularly the idling to reduce 20% demand. Okay, that means you're gonna have less water to some number, 20%. Do you cut the deliveries down to 80% of what people were asking for? Because you can't, there's no scenario where you can tell the farmers to idle or to cut back or change crops.
We're not doing actually anything. It is just a planning model, so we are just coming up with a scenario in which in the future demand is lower.
Well,
Yeah, Peter, I agree with you. I think that this is a real forward choice of terms. If you want, like, just to say, well, 20% less than what we're using today as a bookend, that's fine, but this is inflammatory.
Well, I'm not sure it's inflammatory.
It is to my constituents.
Yeah. Good, okay, we have low bookend, we have baseline, we have high bookend.
Does it say idle?
I understand idle.
Oh, let's remove the word idling. It could be done from a variety of different ways. Okay, we will remove idling. Okay.
Take that out.
If we're spending all this money and time to build a model, it should be based in reality.
Okay.
Like, I mean, this just isn't realistic.
But the reality is the board could adopt a policy very easily that prohibits watering of
Right.
ornamental turf.
Right, I don't think it's.
So I don't know that it's,
Maybe
I think the word idling is probably not the best idea, but
Idling is a very specific term.
it is, and we should delete that. So we'll
We can get rid of that.
get that
You
deleted.
have to work, 20%, won't be idle. We'll have to work at it.
Yeah, correct.
So I'm gonna go away from this question with, if 20%, is the low end, and it happens, you will just be delivering 80% of what you used to, and the farmers and the users will make their adjustments to your amount of water that you supply, right?
No, that's not what we're saying. We are simply showing a 20% demand reduction from some unknown alien that comes in and changes something.
Okay, I'm not gonna drag it out,
Gypsy moth.
but.
Well, but in the drought years, we had to go down.
Yeah, but that is different from the drought water contingency.
Okay, but look,
Let's one at a time, we're gonna one at a time, get your question, okay?
question is
Yeah.
the same question.
Okay,
Climate change, agriculture change, all the rest of it, there is a scenario where you will not have the amount of water you have now. You'll have less. And the question is, how does that work in the agricultural community and our towns and all the rest of it? You just cut it off and let people react to less water, or, and I think it's an important question.
So when we go into the scenario portion, we will talk more specifically, but we are just talking about the demand component of the model. I think that the answers you seek you're not getting out of this model. We're not coming up with a specific policy the board is going to adopt to reduce demand by 20% right now. This was shown as the low bookend, as a request from the stakeholder group. And their original idea was a huge decline in population.
All I'm saying is, if we're down to 80%, you're gonna have to say something to somebody about getting less water, so.
We're talking about over a 50-year period. We're not talking about anything we're actually going to do right today.
Climate change is happening now.
The scenarios here, I just want to make it absolutely clear,
Yeah.
these are not a recommendation or a, suggestion that this will happen, should happen. It's, it is just looking at an absolute extreme bookend case, and I take full responsibility for the word idling, my apologies for that. I mean, by whatever means, it's
Come out to the ranch and we'll talk about idling.
a reduction of demand of 20%. I'm dealing with a lot down in Madera County.
Yeah, okay, yeah, don't mention idling.
Yeah, that's, it's
Reduced to unknown cause, uncertainty.
Yes, I can see how it's a very concerning word.
Perhaps this is, it's just a good time to introduce, just quickly, I have about 6 pages of comments and questions dutifully. Jennifer, at the last meeting, asked me to compile the questions that I had in the ag water management plan and the urban water management plan that had not been answered. And I have beautifully done that, starting on page 3. It's kind of, comes off a little snarky, but in context of the way they were originally written, it was much kinder. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt or whatever. But what I wanted to point out was the fire history. If you look at the fire history, we are living in the only corridor, or one of the very few corridors in the Sierra that has not burned in 120 years. And if you listen to the fire experts, they anticipate that the next mega fire will be somewhere between Lincoln, Yuba City, and perhaps Baxter and Washington. This is the zone that is at risk of a mega fire. That's why they hit the river fire with such incredible intensity. And in that case, you would look at Paradise as the model for what happens to the community. And my heart breaks when I say this community has not a fire in the tail. It is not doing fuel reduction as if its own hair was on fire. And as a result, I look at this community, I look at the condition of the forests, and I say, this community will burn catastrophically in the next 10 to 20 years if radical action is not taken. And that would reduce by 40%. So there are uncertainties out there. Another way you could reduce by 20%, and Director Hall and I have had several conversations about this. As a former leaser of 65 acres and bought 5 miners inches, fully 2.5 of them were an overpurchase. Karen has detailed some neighbors who are doubling what they do. People can throughout buy more than they need because they know that in real droughts, you take a 2 miners inch orifice and replace it with a 1 miners inch orifice, and that's the only tool you have to actually reduce someone out there in a radical drought situation. You probably would reduce water demand by 20% if you could actually have the trust and agreement of your customers not to overbuy water. So lots of ways to get to this 20% reduction. Thank you for taking the word idling out of it.
All right, so a low bookend could be a giant wildfire.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we're gonna move on. Katie.
All right, I'll quickly go through the treated water customers then, but similar, we have on the low bookend, we have a reduction in, you know, the customer base, or a reduction in the demand, and that's tied to, in this case, population decline for whatever reason over the next 50 years, to the lowest population since 2000. That's seen as kind of a, you know, the furthest back in the recent historical period to look at. In the baseline and the high bookend, very similar to the raw water customers, we expanded the, you know, the customer base based on a similar to the historical rate. Again, looking at the baseline, was similar to the historical rate, about 50 customers per year within the soft service areas. And then on the high bookend, adding, you know, 50% to that, 75 customers.
This is treated water out in
Treated
those
water.
soft service areas?
Treated water.
Yeah, when we say soft service, we also mean like infill areas.
Yeah.
So, which is a majority of what the soft service of treated water are.
Okay.
Unlike the areas we just annexed, you know, that we can.
Yeah.
So if Nevada County hits 105,000 population, Newtown then is triggered. Do we factor that in?
Newtown ditch?
The Newtown, down at,
Newtown?
Newtown.
Oh, a new town,
But
okay.
it's called Newtown, it's in the general plan.
I was hearing.
It's
So, but we're-
is it 1,000 acres or 1,000 homes?
Where is it?
Peter, you're on the board when you.
Barbara, do you know?
So fast.
Maybe Barbara knows what you're talking about.
It's probably not 1,000.
I don't know what that number is.
Probably 1,000 homes.
If it's in the current zoning information, then that's been incorporated into this document.
Okay.
If it has not been, then it would not be.
But also, remember what it's showing you, like, under the baseline, is that the absorption rate of any new development, regardless of where it's at, whether it's Newtown or another infill parcel somewhere, is about 50 parcels per year, which is about right for,
What's happening?
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Rich, now I got an answer for you, but I'm forward to ask it. The county is looking at 2-3% increase in population over a very long period of time. And they have not come up with numbers that I can see, whether that's gonna be an expansion of the settled areas into the farming areas or what, but, you know, so I haven't seen those projections, where they're gonna be, which really is important to this discussion.
It's very important.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's a moderate growth rate.
Yes.
Yeah, 2 to 3% per year is pretty high. It's used
Higher
for,
than it's been.
well, it's used for a planning number, but over time.
2 and 3% over 40, 50
Not every
years.
year.
Not every year.
I gotcha, I was like, I don't.
Okay, I'm with
Okay.
you now, I'm with you now.
Yeah.
It's basically flat projection for a very long.
Or loss. Michael Ross again. I just wanted to make sure I understand the metrics on the population increase, for the district, correct? And the district has exclusion areas like Grass Valley and, the city. And if in the future scenarios, those areas were brought into the district, that would include a population increase, correct? And were those scenarios part of this scenario?
Not a water increase.
No, they were not included. They're not included in the current treated water numbers. We deliver them raw water.
So you're not including those population possible increases?
They're included in the baseline raw water deliveries under,
The municipal.
So it's actually considered as part of the municipal supplies and the municipal projections. That was, that came, we generated those numbers based on the urban water management plan, projections of the municipal, growth. So it's consistent with those. And that is a raw water, that's raw water that is supplied to the municipal, customers effectively. That's not considered in this raw water baseline expansion to those.
or in the treated water.
No, it's a separate number that are the municipal supplies.
Perfect. Okay, let's go on.
Okay, all right, so the next few slides, we'll talk quickly through the evapotranspiration projections. This is a slide from our previous presentation, just to provide the refresher on the factors that are considered when calculating our projected evapotranspiration. So we have our climate-related factor, that's this ETO here on the left. And that is to factor in projected changes in temperature over time. And then we also have the local crop coefficients, which we talked about at length in the last presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions if needed, but that's the crop-related factors. So the next couple slides, we'll go through what was considered for, ETO projections and also the crop coefficient projections. So on the ETO side, we of course have 3 different climate change scenarios. So this is one case where the ETO numbers, so climate-related factors that impact evapotranspiration, that is going to need to be run 3 different times for each of the demand scenarios, because we want to look at the cross between all the demand scenarios and all the climate change scenarios. So for the purpose of the next few slides, I'm just going to focus in on the kind of the low bookend, wet climate change scenario, baseline median, and the high bookend dry scenarios, just for the purposes of discussion, but of course there need to be these 9 scenarios, and that's all feeding into the reservoir operations model. So this table here shows the, ETO, which I just mentioned, we'll just look at 3 of them for now, but in every case, we look at every climate scenario. On the crop coefficient side, this ties into the sensitivity analyses that we did discussed in our last presentations. We looked at how does the crop-related factor that impacts evapotranspiration differ for all the different, pixels or parcels or fields across the district that are pasture or that are, some kind of deciduous crop or orchard or whatever land use that is. So we looked at on our low bookend, or I'll start with the baseline. So for the baseline scenario, we looked at the median for, all those different fields that are pasture and all those different fields that are orchards, and all those different, fields that are, or areas that are the different land uses in the district. On the low bookend, we looked at the 25th percentile crop coefficient. So those result in about a 15% or so reduction in evapotranspiration, and that could be from any number of factors. Maybe that's going to be cultivation practices are changing, maybe the particular, types of crops of each sort that are being grown, pasture, maybe it's a different variety of, vegetation that's being grown there. Same on the high bookend. So we looked at the 75th percentile crop coefficient. In that case, maybe that's a very, very well-watered, irrigated field, whereas on the low bookend, maybe that's deficit irrigated. So there's all sorts of factors that can influence those crop coefficients. So we looked at the, low, baseline, and high for all three of those climate scenarios. We also looked back into the past. So we have the data that we use to develop those crop coefficients, is that open ET data that we talked about last time. And that we had a comparison of that data from 2016 through 2022, which is the period of record we have for that, with the climate scenario data that we had for temperature. We kind of looked back in the past then, looking at the temperature during that same period, 2016 through 2022, and checked to see that we're more or less aligned with what we saw in the open ET data. And we do see similar trends and similar median values and similar values across all the different crops. So we feel that this is a reasonable method for projecting future evapotranspiration based on the temperature data that we have. With that then, that concludes our overview of the different inputs that were revised or changed to create those different demand scenarios. So now I think we just have a couple slides left. We'll talk through some results of those three scenarios, looking at the the low demand, baseline, and high demand, and looking specifically at the for the low demand scenario, we're just looking at the wet climate conditions. For the baseline scenario, we're looking at the median climate conditions. In the high scenario, we're looking at the dry conditions. So these provide a range of bookends that we expect that the other climate scenarios and other combinations of climate and demand scenarios will generally fall probably within these ranges. So for the baseline scenario, and this is just the treated water, this slide here is just showing the treated water customer and raw water customer demand deliveries, but of course this gets bundled up to the reservoirs, and in the next presentation next month, which we'll talk about in a second, we'll see some results from kind of the reservoir sides of things, and that'll include then those environmental flows, that'll include municipal supplies and the like the system loss and everything that's considered part of the demand. So we see, in our baseline scenario, on average, about 130,000 acre-feet per year, give or take, between 2022 and 2071. On the high side, we see about 30,000 acre-feet more, and on the low side, about 50,000 acre-feet less. And we see on the left there, on the time series plot, any given year, it might have as much as 200,000 acre-feet of demand in that high scenario, and maybe down as low as 60,000 acre-feet or so in that lowest demand scenario. So, somewhere within these bookends is where we think the future lies. Where exactly within those bookends, time will tell, and that is perhaps, part of the process moving forward is checking in with these assumptions, and maybe it's not 20 acres of new area that's being added, maybe it's 50 acres, or maybe it's only 5. So that's, those are factors that, we're taking our best understanding of what we think could happen in the future now, but surely, every fortune teller is wrong last time, right? So, the crystal ball does not tell us exactly what's going to happen. So there are not any other questions on this slide.
I have a question.
Okay.
I think that this is a good slide, and thank you very much. This is good data, and this depicted very well, and your scenarios make sense. And I would just suggest that the district look deeply into what it's meant by demand management alternatives. And I think that you could show in the district with different demand management alternatives that have already been spoke about, that you could take the median, here the green line, and you can actually reduce it to be the blue line through demand management alternatives, as opposed to supply alternatives. In order to do that with CEQA and everything, you're going to have to do that for any supply alternative anyway. So making that part of the plan for water at this point would be very beneficial.
Did you include a 8-month irrigation season?
Not in these scenarios.
All sales?
Can that be an input once we get it rolling? Can we say, what if we did an 8-month season?
we'll talk about, we could potentially modify the high bookend to include a longer irrigation,
I mean,
prorate that.
we have a lot of people asking for it. Fire season is getting extended into October, November. So it really benefits the community having more water out there.
Dry springs are a problem too.
Yeah, right.
Yes, they are.
I find a lot more validity in that being a bookend. One comment on this, I agree with Michael. If you could just add the historical average as a reference.
Yeah, I was interested to find what that would be too. What is our historical?
That way, when we look at it, we don't have to go, how much are we doing today?
Yeah.
Or even a note, footnote, historical average is, 100.
Good suggestion.
Okay. With that then, unless there are other questions, this is our final slide.
I don't see any from members at home. Do we have any more questions? Right.
Alright, yeah, so yeah, next step is same.
Very nice to have.
Yeah.
Hold on, we're almost done.
Just,
Oh, I was just gonna say, next steps are really the same as we've already seen in the previous next step slides, but, effectively, now that we have the projected demand scenarios and the unimpaired inflows, that's feeding then into the reservoir operations model. There'll be a presentation in August on those. And then, in future, looking down the road, we'll be looking at those strategic alternative scenarios so that, how then, could NID adapt to maybe these different scenarios.
A question, with the plan here. What are we using now? What is our demand, acre feet? 30 a year,
oh, total is about 128.
128?
Yeah.
She's gonna add that to the slide.
We'll add that to the slide so you have a reference point.
Just wanted to note that on kind of the tic-tac-toe slide, that the high demand that we saw in that red graph was actually a dry year, and high bookend dry, and high bookend low would look quite different. In other words, if the tic-tac-toe bookend low, you'd have a more exaggerated series of parameters, the slide that we saw. Yeah.
So with the, it would look different. I guess the thing with the climate change scenarios is that, they're on the slide described as kind of wet, medium, dry, but as we saw in the previous presentation, it's more complicated than that with regard to precipitation and temperature. These wet, medium, and dry do refer to, what's happening on the upstream kind of inflow side of things. So like wet, very much, a lot of inflows, on the dry side, much lower inflows. So yes, it would look a lot different looking at any of these other climate change scenarios, but just for the purposes of kind of simplifying the presentation today, we kind of showed a range of.
To give an understanding
Exactly.
of the way you're approaching it.
Exactly.
It does not give the full understanding of the breadth of the output from the show. In other words, the demand will be a good deal higher than 182, correct?
Well, so on the.
If it was going, if tic-tac-toe was going.
So in the high bookend scenario for like the demands on the left there, the bottom row on the left, that's where we have, many things are conspiring to have, significant demand. So huge growth, huge population increases, high ET, from a crop coefficient perspective. On the dry scenario, I guess we need to have perhaps a summary here of kind of what the precipitation looks like, but theoretically, in a drier scenario, if there is, lower water available from precipitation for other, to help meet parts of those demands, then in that dry scenario, that would theoretically contribute to like a higher demand because more water needs to be provided from irrigation as opposed to coming in from the rain. So that's why we showed
In the
those.
range of all the scenarios, it would be interesting to see what the outside parameters are.
Yeah.
These are example parameters, not necessarily the most radical high use or the most radical low use, right?
Well, we feel like these are,
Yes.
they are representative of the kind of the bookends of those scenarios, but we will show all 9 in the report. And
Just another piece of when you look at this from a fire perspective, from a fire paradigm, there's other things other than just reduced demand after a disastrous fire. There are basically revelations that you might have as an agency, like wooden flumes in the forest is not a good way to deliver water.
Had that revelation many times.
These are fairly straightforward things. I mean, I give a couple of examples for the South Canal. What are you gonna do? You're gonna tunnel it up top? Or are you gonna run it down the Bear River and pump it up from 174? One's underground in a pipe, one's underground in a tunnel. One you can service. If the other one collapses, who knows? I mean, these are in a planning, what are you planning for, and what are you planning to operate within? And if it's within the revelations of what fire is gonna do for us, that's one. Another is, if you're gonna be a good neighbor, you will be managing your lands, like I am managing mine. That's $1,000 per acre per year over 10 years to get to the point where you can use prescribed fire. So, of course, in my neighborhood, you've got a couple of thousand acres. It was reserved for a 1926 proposal for a reservoir. You're gonna be $3 million a year taking care of that property in order to be a good neighbor to me in a fire paradigm. You have to do that work, or the community is going to burn. And you have many more acres than that. To the south of Rollins Reservoir is horribly fuel-loaded NID property. You need to take a real close look at what kind of property you own as a property owner and build that into your plan for water, because it's millions of dollars a year. I don't want to go into the rest of some other kinds of stuff. What is going to be the growth rate of this community when fire insurance is no longer available, and that's right around the corner. My fire insurance went from $800 to $4,500. I'm in a fair plan. It's a pool. When Nevada City burns, my $4,500 will go to $12,000 or $25,000. At which point I'm on my own. Hopefully I build a house and can't burn. And I do fuel reduction and I do prescribed burning. So I got a pretty good chance if I'm on my own. But nonetheless, those are the ideas. I do want to thank you guys for the work that you're doing. I appreciate the work that your consultants are doing. I find it good. I find that you are blessed with a huge amount of water, a huge amount of storage capacity, a huge amount of water rights. You are doing this planning scenario game amidst abundance and great blessings. And it's a cause for deep appreciation and the luxury you have to do it in this kind of a way. That's probably enough said for the moment.
All right, thank you so much, Otis.
Jennifer, I appreciate the presentation that you made. As I look at where you are amidst the abundance, what you don't have is any abundance of money from hydro taxes, anything else. You got to be as frugal as you can possibly be. And when you made your presentation, although I wasn't there in person, you are emphasizing putting your nose to the grindstone and doing the things that you must do within the budget you have. And I'm grateful to see that trend. I'm grateful to see the direction you're taking. And I will be looking for the rest of this program.
Thank you, Otis. And we will leave today being grateful for the abundance that we do have in our district and the strength of the district. So thank you so much, and we'll see some of you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.